Hey everyone, tonight we'll start with one of the most peculiar occupations in ancient Rome. The orgy planner. Yeah, someone needed to plan the wine and keep an eye on the vines, plan the entertainment, and ensure that no one unintentionally brings their mother-in-law. That may seem ridiculous, even opulent, but Roman feasting culture was about more than just luxury. It was also about networking, power, and position. Quite an amount of nudity, so please take a moment to like the video before you settle in. Please, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and only subscribe if you actually love what I do here. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from around the globe, so tell me what time it is for you. Now, turn off the lights. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together. Your eyes. And perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum. You are the organizer of tonight's elite. Thus, you are open before daylight, not out of discipline, but because of anxiety. Roman orgy, which indicates that before breakfast, your sleeping mat's brain has already generated 17 potential problems, is still warm, your shirt is crumpled, and a scroll has already been pushed beneath your door, making it crackle menacingly. With a soldier's grim determination, you unfold it to discover that it's from your patron's wife, who would like to remember you that the rose petals were yellow instead of red the last time, and the visitors' Rome is barely waking up outside. And I observed that you haven't even touched your barley yet. Up, but you're already mentally clutching burning ampe. Senators, artists, philosophers, and 2 courtesans are among the guests today. Despise one another. And there are rumors that someone from the imperial family would, if someone tells you that Caligula might be your cousin, you'll be accused of not giving someone's peacock enough treatment. You put on your sandals and start the day with a clipboard and dread, just like any other Roman orgy planner. You dispatched runners yesterday to make the flight reservation as your first business staffing order. None have, including harpists, dancers, females, and a man who balances a tray of figs on his feet while walking on his hands. Verify that you believe at least 2 people are intoxicated in the Subaru right now. And then there's the meal you asked for. Dates, olives, roasted dormice, figs, oysters, honey, and a few dubious meats. Everything must arrive fresh, or at least freshish, from the eastern provinces. Oh, and don't forget the pillows. One lousy oyster, and half the forum will be saying that you poisoned Senator Gas. The consequence was political the last time one of the deans fell under a thick toga, but this time the sofas need to be strong enough to withstand any damage, and you know exactly what happens to them. The sun is just getting out of bed and already perspiring into your bed linens. You take a deep breath and remind yourself that you are a professional. It will be a long day, but the maestro of lunacy is a choreographer of mayhem. When the wine is served and the pillows are fluffed, the guests won't realize how close you were to yelling. However, even though it's early, you're already opening a new scroll for today. You scan the updated guest list cautiously, bracing yourself for the worst. It's not a sitting. Chart with olives on top, Lucius, and a finely balanced social powder. Keg naturally, Calpurnius Piso attends everything and insists on constantly lounging on the middle couch. Ideally, his wife Aurelia's issue is adjacent to someone else's wife's. She wasn't invited, but that didn't stop her from coming before you made a note. Distinct sofas, distinct wine supplies, and absolutely no harp solos during the last time. She tossed a garum jug. They were both present. Senator Petronius Arbiter has since embraced a humorous, violent, and sometimes eloquent man in a he should be seated far away from Junius Blacus, whose poetry has a poetic feeling. When Petronius wrote about a slow death in meter, you can see that it's Decianus, and 2 unnamed guests' ambiguity could be offensive. Be respectful. Your clients might be gladiators or giraffes wearing togas. West End seating is movable, and now it's time for the 4 flute performers. The mime twins and the 3 dancers are already one more act than. Although he views mimes as barbarous, Lucullus finds them acceptable, wonderful, and he believes that his reputation depends on his mistress's approval. A live map of ancient Roman tension, politics, power, passion, and family feuds. The guest list is more than just a collection of names. and vendettas lounging on silk-upholstered couches and sipping from the identical common wine bowl, and of course, the true dread of someone significant who was not invited. And the rumors that it was done on purpose are already audible. You roll up the scroll and make a public insult. I will never again offer him my bath slaves. New one, you circle names, add warnings, and draw arrows. You're not throwing a party. Even if you're running a live diplomatic simulation with roasted, dorm and aphrodisiacs, you've done this before. You'll do it again, but this time, hopefully, nobody will stab someone over the location of the couch, unlike last spring with the "it's time" for the finalized guest list, or one that is stable enough to not collapse. It takes more than just blazing torches and pouring wine to prepare a Roman orgy for the next catastrophe. It involves creating a dinner that is so rich that the gods feel underdressed. Since the list currently consists of 3 tablets, let's begin with the most fundamental wine, not just any. When you write 3 Amphi Fernian 2, your sponsor will be impressed by the wine's age and price. Of Cuban for serving a vinegar to late arriving guests, followed by freshly imported oysters from when they come, the bayai must be alive, or at least plausibly moist. Reminding the seafood vendor that half of the oysters were already dead the prior time, as one of the guests reported a sign that he is still recuperating, followed by honey-roasted dormice, which are a mainstay of Roman decadence. They must be plump, not stringy, when dipped in honey and rolled in poppy seeds. If you ask for 50, you will get 35, and if you add roasted peacock, it will still twitch. Carthaginian figs, cheese wrapped in vine, and Judean dates covered in sa'ada. Additionally, you write a reminder to avoid any garum mishaps near the bread. Anchovy-scented rolls almost started a riot for dessert at the last gathering. You'll need almond cakes with candied almonds and a visual display, like a cake in the shape of a colosseum. Packed with live songbirds, you'll work out the mechanics of baking later. Next is the inexpensive perfume, which contains enough incense to produce dizzy, a Vestal virgin. You stealthily smell the restrooms while you gaze. It costs more than a good villa outside, and the list appears more like a military requisition than a menu. Although this is Rome, Austria, luxury is expected, gluttony is fashionable, and the image of the establishment hinges on visitors being too enthralled with the opulence to realize that the music is out of tune. And you give the scroll to your fastest runner with precise instructions because someone spilled wine on the marble lions. No excuses for replacements, and if he forgets the sugared grapes once more, I'm feeding him to the flamingos while they offer prayers to the deity of Mercury. Let's get things straight out of the way. A vomitorium isn't what you think it is. No, the Romans did not construct specific rooms for the exclusive purpose of purging. More peacock, which is a story that was created later, most likely by someone who witnessed the vomitorium, was the only plausible explanation for the Romans' eating habits. Refers to the areas where people would enter and exit Roman amphitheaters following events. However, that doesn't prevent contemporary imaginations from conjuring images of you-up lounges with marble tiles, populated by feather fans and perfume. Nobles claimed that Romans overindulged and that if a guest discreetly excused themselves to step, no one asked any questions. Hence, it's your responsibility as an orgy planner to verify the entire space, including the triclinium, atrium, and private garden alcove, are prepared to bear the repercussions of excessive fashion. You start the examination of mosaic tiles must shine on banquet hall flooring, particularly the area with Bacchus. If you need a quick manicure while riding a panther, you can remove a grape stem that has become lodged in the restrooms, are sanitized, scented, and stocked with new toiletries. And the grout from last week's event is up to your standards. A candle glows softly close to the sponges on sticks. The lemon's vinegar is refreshed, and you double-check the doorway in the courtyard, not for light, but for dignity. Visitors frequently recline too far in fountain basins and then topple in after. Since a general's wife almost drowned in the koi pond while holding their 5th goblet, pass through the perfume room where you can't remove the wife, but you can remove the koi. You can indulge in rose, cinnamon, myrrh, and oils and salves, presented like an apothecary. After taking a sample, you notice that your wrist smells like a wonderful love letter to Venus. Next, you check the vomitorium, myth chamber, which is a calm corridor furnished with a chair, a bronze sink, a curtain, and everyone is aware that the retreat is the name of the courteous slave stationed with a fan, even if it isn't named that. Because it also needs to be clean, perfumed, and sparkling. No one leaves this party tonight, no matter how extravagant things get, feeling degraded. And if they do purge, they'll do it in front of gleaming marble. And it's mid-morning, and it's time for some elegant murals of satyrs. Perhaps the most delicate aspect of your work is not managing nobles or choosing wines. However, serving a Roman feast of this size to the servants calls for a lot of people, many individuals, and none of them awoke this morning with the intention of joining another aristocrat in his extravagant fever dream. You collect the most of the team members in the atrium. 23 bodies have a role, and some were born in the sum. Others purchased them specifically to carry trays for pouring wine in the home, or appearing lovely while remaining silent. Some are hired actors, and everyone is under stress. You initially assign the cupbearers to their central triclinium perimeter zones. Unless instructed otherwise, remind them to dilute the strong wine. In the West Garden Lounge, fanbearers are next, but visitors believe they can handle full Fernian. Their timing is very important and can make or ruin a guest's comfort level. One too weak and someone perspires, and one too strong and you've blown out a candle or revealed someone's secrets. Fruit attendants are okay, but neither is appropriate for a silk cushion. Grapes should only be peeled upon request, and trays should be regularly refreshed, and covertly remove any fruit that starts to look like a raisin, after which the musicians start arguing. Regarding tempo, you divide the lyre and the flute girl the last time The argument devolved into such an embarrassing duet that the guests paused in the middle of the song to give the couple marriage counseling. Oil and eyeliner-clad dancers lean dramatically against a pillar while acting as though they aren't listening as you go over their signals. Anyway, you say forcefully that we are not improvising. Making eye contact with the youngest slave, a youngster little older than 10, who is in charge of the Bakik fire incident. For gathering abandoned sandals, you nod, and he nods in return. After a silent agreement that he won't let you down, you eventually deliver your typical speech. You are mute unless someone speaks to you tonight, and invisible unless called. You embody elegance, grace, and rhythm, or I promise by Jupiter that I will put you on sponge duty until Saturnalia, after which there's a you take a breath. The human engine has finished with the collective nod briefings. Oil is pulverized and aligned behind Roman debauchery for the time being. Each time the wine is delivered and the invitations are sent out, the silk cushions are plump, and as soon as you start to feel more in control, someone rushes into the atrium, gasping for air. You grit your teeth because, of course, the musicians haven't arrived. You reserved a flute girl, 2 cithara musicians, and a backup pair in this particular circumstance, and yet here you are, looking down the barrel of silence at a gathering where it is deemed a civic transgression. You send your most trustworthy welcome to Rome's Sabura neighborhood. A bustling marketplace filled with odors and bad choices are discovered, and you teach them while they're dressed and conscious without even asking. You already know that they're either still asleep or too inebriated to explain why they're late. Stroll or caught up in an enduring romantic relationship that started at Saturnalia's rehearsal last night. The poets are happy that the dancers are now grumbling that they can't practice without musicians. Implies more stage time. You swiftly dispel the notion that nobody wants Gas's tribute to his. You think about contingency when you hear your mother's third marriage recalled at a gathering where guests are enjoying sugared dormice. Plans. Nearby slave has a damaged reed pipe that the home chef can play 2 tunes on. Decent singing voice. In the worst situation, you hum in time if you're not drinking liquor. When a jar of lentils is shaken, you hope it doesn't end up like ghosts. The musicians emerge from incense looking vaguely fashionable but untidy, regretful, with a slight hint of spikenard, and making bad choices. One of the second flute girl appears to have had at least 3 senators break her heart, and she is missing a sandal. You designate their stations, one in the atrium and one close to the main eating room. with a garden setting for atmosphere, stress-free pace. There are no impromptu solos or shifts unless someone is truly dying, in which case they nod. The crisis is avoided for the time being, but you continue to watch the dishonest player since he's too much love is being played on it, too slowly, for someone who isn't going to ruin everything with unplanned love. If the music is the ballad, you may easily remove it by placing him next to the door. Seating is the key to the party. You're not just setting people on sofas, you're also managing competitions. Romances and enough unsaid tension to bring down a Roman mansion made of marble. Triclinium, the traditional 3-couch arrangement, can accommodate 9 people in a comfortable manner. When it's almost 7, if nobody presents their pet leopard, you start by drawing everything out on a wax tablet while whispering to resembles a general planning sofa in the siege center, where the place of honor is allocated for the highest-ranking guests at the summer's locust. But sadly, 2 persons that they are that person. Governor Chrysos and Senator Piso both assert that they are that person via birth, marriage, and sheer self-confidence. You'll have to choose who will take first place and who will moderately contaminated alcohol. You should also keep lovers close to one another, but not too close. Close, unless they are former lovers, in which case a bowl of olives and a nice person must separate them. Incredibly dull in between, followed by the endearing seat fillers. But unmemorable people who work to maintain harmony. You put a rich horseman. The equestrian won't comprehend the poetry when placed next to a theatrical poet to absorb the effect. And the poet will like it's a mutually beneficial relationship that you assign courtesans to strategic places close. To the wealthy, lonely, or recently divorced people, you also assign 2 of them to the west side, because Aurelia will be bothered by it, and she wants something to do, not because it matters. Naturally, you allow for uncertainty when you complain about something other than the wine's temperature. Someone might show up, someone will spill wine, demand a complete reshuffle, or uninvitedly exchange seats to make a statement. Maintain a few empty cushions for last-minute flexibility and plausible deniability. A spot for the poet to pout if necessary. Once the seating arrangement is complete, you look at your creation like a sculpture. Regarding his marble, you roll up the scroll and offer it to him, knowing full well that someone will strike it with a hammer before dusk. Start it off with this directive. For Jupiter's love, put name tags in wax. You know they will switch them, so don't let anyone do that. But at least you tried. The backstage arena for Orgy's performance is the kitchen, and it has a burning stench, figs, and complete chaos. And by mid-afternoon, the whole home is a controlled culinary ballet. A former naval cook who is now a domestic warlord is already in a state of chaos. You hear the words honey as you yell at a scared assistant about the right stuffing ratio for roasted dormice. I'll personally toss you into the Tiber with poppy seeds. Great, everything's on. Plan tonight's main event, the reapplied peacock, roasting whole feathers. It looks amazing for dramatic flair, tastes like shoe leather, and is primarily served in a way that allows wealthy customers to boast about consuming food that was formerly strutted like a diva. The kitchen is preparing a pig that has been filled with live birds. Yes, it is a genuine thing, as well as roasting and slicing it. It's amazing and unnerving, and only when the table is open and surprise doves fly out platters of figs, dates, and honey cakes that are quite distressing for the doves. While glazing a pie in the shape of the Colosseum, a slave inadvertently consumes a portion of it. Immediately transferred to grapefruit duty, someone was swirling a vat of garum, the notorious Roman fish sauce produced with anchovies that have been fermented, and the ewe strongly warn everybody within smelling range to keep their tears away. 1 gram-soaked loaf of bread caused a 5-day fight and spoiled last month's affair. Between 2 magistrates as the amphorae of Fernion for wine storage are being organized. Less expensive vintages for the primary attendees, so you make sure the amphora are. You've been burned before, literally, by an irate console with a cleverly labeled, every area of the kitchen is bustling with tension platters being used on sensitive palates, pastry horns full of mystery, reduced meats and refined sauces. You're smelling, tasting and guiding everywhere, At once means you're not merely handling a supper, you're in charge of an edible show that's supposed to dazzle, make people drunk, and withstand being thrown during a disagreement. The head cook barks if someone drops another as you pass the oven. You nod. Everything is going great. I'm feeding them to the peacock dormouse. It should be simple to choose a fragrance, yet in ancient Rome, perfume was a statement, and tonight's orgy is no place for it. When it comes to amateur olfactory choices, the guests will not only taste and observe luxury, but need to smell it. The air must be filled with temptations to money, and the kind of confidence that only those who soak in imported rose oil before entering the storage area, which is lined with small alabaster jars, shelves resembling holy artifacts, like Arabian myrrh, Ceylon saffron, and cinnamon oil from Cilicia, along with a test mixture known as essence of Nile lotus, which it smells like a pricey pond that you've all scented. Like a battle plan, you start creating the fragrance strategy twice in the atrium. We'll have a crisp, clear initial note with a scent of citrus and cedarwood. Tricenium is used for stronger fragrances, such as myrrh, frankincense, and a hint of musk. You might make a mistake tonight, and that's okay. Should be whispered by the private. Secrets will be shared, and togas will be placed strategically in garden alcoves. Sultry combination of rose, cinnamon, and just enough spikenard to induce fainting. For guests' hands and feet, there are scented oils available if they approach too closely. Nobody wants cold oil, so you assign an attendant to warm them up a little. Warm oil is for barbarians, and yes, it is for sex and nice illumination. You're not a barbarian, and you've scented the restrooms as well. You tell your employees, don't be too critical. We want luxury, not suffocation. If a senator enters and accuses the dancer of causing his nosebleed, we've gone too far. She asks for a seductive personal perfume, and you provide her with a powerful combination. When you warn her that it previously provoked a little riot during a Saturnalia feast, she smiles and says she'll use it. In any case, you follow your nose like a trained dog as you move through the hallways. The air is starting to get warmer, spicier, and more luxurious, and a fragrant wind is blowing through. The scent of indulgence is like a whispered secret, and you nod. The house is almost ready to get its fragrance thanks to its scented lighting and full arsenal of scents. It's late afternoon. The air smells of warm air, and all the guests need right now is mayhem. Citrus roasted meat and costly choices you've made for each duty. The moment of truth has arrived after threatening everyone required and buying the harpist off to stay sober until at least dessert. The last tour begins at the entrance where each oil lamp is ignited individually. They cast a golden glow as they softly flicker on polished marble, saying, fresh petals are sprinkled at the flower boy, who says, "You're not poor tonight." The last time someone slipped on lavender, you reminded him not to go overboard, and sued into the atrium, where grapes are flowing from bronze fountains. Pillows that are pyramided in ridiculously ludicrous arrangements have been battered, fluffed, and then placed with strange... To make it appear less manufactured, you can shift the symmetry a little. It's crucial that decadence feels natural, even if it's 32 hours and 2 minor malfunctions were required to get the main event area ready for the tricenium. Every cushion has been dusted, and the tables and recliners are at the ideal angle, scented and carefully rearranged to cover up any wine stains from the disastrous senator's birthday celebration last month. When you examine the tableware, the bounce test is soft enough to be comfortable and sturdy enough to withstand. Activity. Artfully placed are blown glass amphorae, bread, bronze plates, and silver goblets. Even though the cheese is perspiring a little, you determine it adds authenticity and stealthily remove an insect from a fig so no one notices. Never occurred in the garden, and the faint, uncertain lighting is perfect, just bright enough to prevent mishaps involving potted plants and attractive enough. When a servant with dignity fans incense, the impression is ethereal. You stop and allow enjoy it for a moment, but notice a tiny detail, a bloom that's not quite right. Make a last adjustment and repair the curtain that isn't quite even. You take a deep breath, pay attention, and move across the room as though you were a visitor. Gorgeous, absurd, overly ideal. You sigh briefly, allowing yourself to think that everything is under control. The honored visitor has arrived early, and he brought 3 more. Wives, of course he did. You fix your tunic, grin broadly, and enter. The fray, the first knock is more of a dramatic thump than a knock, and then there's laughter. Take a breath, and let's go. When the door opens, a slave gracefully draws back the curtain to make an impression. But not enter Lucius Calpurnius Piso, your first visitor, who enters like he owns. The house smells of strong wine and ambition, even though he hasn't paid for any of it. He meets you with a smile and a wink tonight, my buddy, wearing expensive fragrance that costs more than a soldier's yearly salary. 'Cause Bacchus to blush as a trail of courtesans, a guy, and a small poet. Follow him. You choose not to verify since you are carrying a little liar who might or might not be welcomed. Guests start to arrive in flowing robes, sandals with embroidery, and gold thread tunics, and displays of impacted boredom. They've all shown up early to demonstrate their importance, and they've all had at least a slave offers fragrant towels, and at least 1 drink to demonstrate their relaxation. You have to mentally recalculate the alcohol rations. Another offers rosewater, but one visitor declines both, and instead requests a tiny. You give him spiced wine as a sign of love for something more Dionysian. If you don't correct him, the garden will be filled with murmuring. He considers it intelligent. Judgments, introductions, and quiet discussions that are somehow louder than the actual talk. Someone has already inquired as to the location of the flute girls, and another person is observing the mound of fruit. You keep moving, nodding, and adjusting as if it owes them money. Governor Crisis is also lounging a lot, as you can see by the senators who haven't spoken since the goat insult episode. One of the dancers strays, revealing that the poets are congregating in a corner like storm clouds near someone else's wife. Timing is important if you snap your fingers too soon in the center. If everything starts too early, the surprise is lost. If it starts too late, guests complain. You want suspense. In a simmering scandal, you stealthily pick a grape from a serving tray and retain it. It's going on when you see one of the guests dozing on a cushion and another polishing a dagger with butter. Well, the greatest compliment for a Roman orgy is controlled anarchy, and tonight the flute girls are finally sober, the lyres are tuned, and you're nearly insulted, or at least balanced, and you give the nod when the dancers are lubricating their limbs as though they're going to engage in combat. A silence descends upon the triclinium as the first dancer takes the stage as the performance starts. Golden veils streaming forward, ankles flowing, and chiming eyes locked someplace between. With divine inspiration and total indifference, she starts to move in a lovely manner. The flute adds a dreamy quality and precisely the amount of dramatic sensuality that makes senior senators feel lyrical. For a brief, lovely moment, the entire feast is filled with slow, swirling notes that float through the scented air like incense. Falls into rhythm chewing, which quiets down talks and even causes the poet to pause, attempting to recite, but naturally, a guest interrupts. Requests that the leader and the swan tale be reenacted, to which another responds, no. This time, Orpheus is in the underworld with actual torches. A third person proposes a scene with nude gladiators. You grin nicely and reassure them that the water jug and interpretive juggling are all part of the plan. Meanwhile, the mime twins, who were instructed to hold off on starting until the third wine course, arrive early. Half the audience laughs while the other half mimes an exaggerated scene of seduction involving a sausage and fig. Appears perplexed, and one man cheers as if it were the Pompey Theatre, and you fight the desire to pour wine straight into your eyes while the musicians and dancers continue try to adjust when you see the harpist improvising a perhaps melancholy piece. Because it appears that someone throws a peach after she just realized she's playing in the wrong key. Unintentional, but as another visitor tosses a fig back, it becomes interactive. Quickly intervene, raise your hand, and declare it a symbolic offering to Bacchus. Everyone applauds, and the situation is avoided. A warning not to offer throwable fruit ever again, while the entertainment moves forward. Music swells, laughter swells, and a flame. It's pandemonium, beautiful and scented, as a dancer performs by the pool, a flute girl trips, and a visitor pops the question to a statue. Dramatic pandemonium, and here is your moment to shine as a stage manager, or orgy planner. You change a light nod to a mood wrangler fig diplomacy. Server and go silently in the darkness as though this had been done on purpose. By the third course, the wine is being worshipped instead of served. In full bloom, the guests are sprawled, out on their couches like inebriated gods. Laughing too much, acting too brazenly, and losing track of basic information like who they arrived. You gave the servers instructions to carefully dilute the wine. Fernian is powerful. Amphora can persuade a senator to confess to tax fraud or sing poetry, and you dilute the wine for the ambitious and preserve it for the already hopeless. It's diplomacy by the jug, and the discussions become less philosophical and more intimate. A young patrician boasts about his money while openly comparing it to Jupiter's. You pretend not to hear a woman wearing pearls whispering a joke about the emperor's feet amid 3 villas and a camel. She is excellent with seating arrangements, so you will miss her if she is exiled. Using suspicious-sounding lyrics, a poet is attempting to woo a philosopher across the hall. You pass by just in time to hear that your eyes are as dark as olives after being plagiarized. And briny, you fail to step in when 2 courtesans are imprisoned in a... The smell of planned murder permeates every chuckle, and every grin is a dagger in a passive-aggressive compliment battle. One gives the other a fig, and you mentally note that you should get rid of all the figs by dessert. Naturally, someone has chosen to start a drinking game involving gladiator trivia. Identify 3 in the back corner. A minor senator tries to pass for someone with famous diamonds or a drink. He is jeered for his response, drinks, and then quietly falls onto a pillow. He starts quoting Virgil while a visitor is speaking in the yard, he thinks. He's being philosophical, yet all he's doing is describing how many slaves it takes to maintain a marble fountain. Stops him since it's customary for the wine to flow more quickly now that the aeri are opened like promises. Our glasses are never empty. Names are blurred, boundaries are blurred, and stories are forgotten. Now the orgy portion is getting near, and you continue to watch the like an experienced general. You modify the lights, slow down the soundtrack, and pause the orgy is getting hotter, and the scandals are just getting worse, as the guests are drinking perfume. By this time in the evening, the party has evolved from being organized to being unstructured. Guests no longer use names due to their decadence to unorganized mythological rubbish. Senators with titles are calling each other that guy with the peacocks or Apollo Venus. 3 people are in the fountain, and one of them seems to be attempting to make a laurel wreath out of table plants. If you choose not to ask, this is the time when most hosts will baptize the others, would freak out, but you take a calm sip of watered wine and start to quietly repair the damage. The mosaic of Neptune is now dangerously close to the gladiator, wrestling reenactment. You gently pull them away and provide a tray of dates as a diversion. It works, and they fall for it just like little children do. Tattoos. 2 guests are absent, and you discover them fighting beneath the table, about maintaining composure while quietly coughing and massaging each other's feet. Nod and act as though you're searching the west alcove for a misplaced bracelet. When a guest questioned the youngster if her instrument was tuned, she broke down in tears. Taken as a metaphor for something completely else, you send the backup lyre over. Player, along with a free basket of pomegranate seeds, she recuperates. In the A huge man is trying to woo a marble bust of Venus in the atrium. You send a servant to turn it slowly while you speak lovely nothings and feed it olives. The man takes it as a challenge and starts spouting love poems when you remove the bust to prevent scandal. Then be honest, it's preferable to his previous. Discussion over grain tariffs. If someone knocks over a torch, you catch it beforehand. When it strikes the tapestry, you remain motionless and do not flinch or perspire. During a whirlwind of moral compromise and satin grapes, you move around the room like a hand is redirected and smoothed by a high priest of excess on a shoulder, a raised eyebrow that warns, "Don't toss that goblet," and a glance across the Room. He sets everything down because he understands that this is your art, your turmoil, and you've barely subdued it. But it's not over yet, since you can hear the clear sound of you take another taste. It's almost time for someone to ride a wine cart down the hallway. With all the subtlety of a fallen amphora, dawn breaks as sunlight crawls across the bloodshed was illuminated by marble flooring, shattered goblets, and a sandal wedged in, oil lamps, a fruit tray, and a nobleman dozing off face down in a beautiful urn are wheezing. The scent has turned into something like remorse. You start your last round of damage assessment by carefully stepping over a flute player who has passed out. The cushions shows a number of togas draped around sculptures in ways that might be considered works of art, or proof that a philosophical limerick was written in wine on the wall. But it doesn't rhyme, but it's surprisingly perceptive. You reach the tricenium. You think about keeping the mound of olives that has been organized in a clumsy figure of the emperor. Then you kick it discreetly. The slaves start the Crete post-orgy clean-up wine ritual beneath the table. Half-eaten, peacocks are carted off with incense ashes, and ruined linens are wrapped up. Swept into orderly, respectable mounds, you whisper directions as if speaking too loudly could cause the deeper disarray you see on the guest list to become apparent. There were no fatalities, only one damaged ankle and 2 unplanned marriages. One really courteous note from a departing philosopher that says, "Thank you. I have discovered things that I must never discuss." You create a list called Debrief It. Includes prohibiting live poetry contests close to open spaces and never serving throwable produce. When future events take place, the Venus statue is destroyed by fire. A loud moan comes from beneath a table, coming from anyone with legal counsel. You respond with a nod, but you don't offer any assistance. The celebration is done, and everyone needs to deal with their own repercussions in the garden, where doves are still straying after the pig exploded. They deserve something, so you gently lead them into a corner and give them some remaining candied almonds after their performance. You take one final look around after the night they've had to endure, sweetie. It was a mess, a victory, a grape-related diplomatic nightmare, and you made it through it. Take off your sandals, go to your room, and fall onto your mat. Praise, no prizes, just the assurance that nobody witnessed the mayhem because you absorbed it. They'll tell you stories on how wonderful it was tomorrow. Just a hint of wind, dry, cracking and bitter dirt greeted the beginning of slumber. Farmers who formerly danced in the broad plains have now taken flight after the once rich and black area was transformed into powder. Their future actually lay on the bright wheat fields that stood helpless. The 1930s were terrible for everyone, save for families from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and the land itself turned against them in eastern Colorado. They had relied on the soil that did the government's incentives and promises of wealth foster the sorrow that thousands of families had experienced. They were unaware that the native grasses were the sole item being used to clear the way for successive rows of wheat, holding the ground in place, and they didn't come back year after year until the rain ceased in 1931. Without roots, the top, dirt had nothing to keep it in place as the drought progressed, started to rise, carried by the wind in ever-thickening clouds, and the storms arrived all at once. The sky changed from blue to dark in an instant, as though night had fallen. Entire communities were engulfed by hundreds of feet-high walls of dust in the middle of the day. Children who were halted by suffocating cattle contracted dust pneumonia. Mothers tucked newspapers into door crevices and used damp towels to seal windows, but dust continued to seep in, coating furniture, dishes, and lungs, which people began referring to as the Dust Bowl. Black Sunday, which will always be remembered as April 14th, 1935, was a huge storm that swept throughout the Oklahoma prairies, where some people thought the world was ending. A preacher allegedly instructed his followers to return home and get ready for judgment, claiming that the storm had blotted out more than 200 kilometers, the sun, and caused hundreds of people to experience darkness. And this brought about a realization. They were unable to remain because the crops, cattle, and soil had all disappeared. What had once been a place of promise had turned into a cemetery of dreams, and youngsters were coughing up dirt. As a result, with broken families turned to pickup trucks, jalopies secured with wire, and everything they owned tied on the roof. Heading west toward California, in search of a better life than, although they were unaware of what awaited them on the other side, they knew. The road west wasn't what they were fleeing, and it was closing in on them. As the Dust Bowl tore through the gold-paved area, it was also paved with desperation. Families piled up as planes launched an exodus unlike any other in American history, into dilapidated Chevrolets and Fords, frequently with 4 flat tires and more kids than seats. Everything they owned, including washboards, mattresses, kettles, and antiques, was cut down. They traveled by rope to a dream California, where Route 66 became the main thoroughfare of its escape route, wound via New Mexico, Arizona, and California, and it extended from the Dust Bowl states to the Pacific. For many, the Central Valley served as more than just a route. It was a lifeline for the villages along the camps, for migrants grew up next to gas stations as the road grew, and each rest area with running water turned into a makeshift. Thousands of them returned home, while an estimated 2.5 million people ran away. The majority were field workers and sharecroppers who worked as small-scale farmers in the 1930s in the southern plains, leaving homes they could no longer live in, fields they couldn't save, and mortgages they couldn't pay, many never as they reached the state line. Others were crying, but California wasn't the promised place they had pictured, with newspaper ads promising vast fields and farm jobs. But the truth was far worse, as the Great Depression had already stifled a large portion of the economy by the time the majority of migrants arrived. Limited, and earnings were less than what was needed to survive near California's state boundary. Highway patrol personnel started excluding those who appeared to be too impoverished, disparagingly referring to them as okays nonetheless. Regardless of their true Oklahoman origins, these migrants were treated with distrust and even outright locals' animosity, fearing they will bring crime, illness, or worse competition for. Despite the lack of jobs, the tourists continued to live in temporary settlements known as Hoovervilles, named after President Hoover, who many held responsible for their predicament. They slept in the fields under cardboard and tarps, picked cotton, peaches, grapes, and whatever else was in season while their kids worked. Beside them, frequently in the intense heat, a day's wages may possibly purchase a small amount of bread. Beans. But despite their humiliation and hunger, they held on to faith that California would finally realize its dream, that the next field would pay more. Even though the journey would be lengthy and dusty led to a better place, because it wasn't simply impossible to go back, meant giving up, and none of them were prepared to do so after arriving in California. Although they were not followed by dust, the thousands of families who came in search of a better life, but instead encountered filthy, overcrowded migrant camps and a hostile reception from whole settlements of improvised homes, tents, and shacks appeared on the edges of cities and orchards. These weren't residences. They were families in survival zones, squeezed into tin shelters, fashioned from scrap wood cardboard and canvas remnants. No privacy, and water from the communal pump toilets were frequently just dugout pits that dozens of people shared. Disease spread quickly. Starvation made the elderly feeble, and infants yelled for their milk parents. Although the air may have been cleaner than in Oklahoma, the atmosphere was nonetheless. Local Californians perceived the migrants as a source of smoldering, tensions, danger. They were concerned that the influx of desperate workers would drive down wages, and they were correct. Growers could now pay peanuts for labor-intensive field work, since they knew that someone would be desperate enough to accept it. Pay fell, and conditions deteriorated. Sometimes, exploitation became the norm, and the federal government's farm security program was the migrants' only source of safety. Administration FSA established a few work camps that provided sanitation and medical services, such as the one at Arvin, California. These government camps were different, clean, and provided basic care and dignity. Even democratic citizens formed committees and resolved conflicts among themselves. But there weren't enough. The majority of families resided in the unofficial, lawless sector outside of this safety net. Communities that surrounded the agricultural valleys. They were frequently hounded by police and forced to leave by irate mobs. Were made to continue moving in order to evade detection, which local authorities called them. Some children who were vagrants were not allowed to attend school, while others were either ill or too occupied in the fields to attend. Yet within these camps, there is a culture of, as resilience increased, people shared food, told stories, and played guitars around campfires, sung songs like Der Reim and Hard Traveling, which helped them express their suffering and their resilience. These were anthems of survival, rather than merely melancholy melodies, because they clung to their community despite life robbing them of their land, house, and security. Because community brought strength, they were impoverished but unbroken, and gradually something strong emerged, started to flourish in the midst of the Dust Bowl. Children's hunger, solidarity. Migrants' early years were not spent playing. Rather, they were a daily endurance workout, and their toys were frequently sticks. Their classrooms were fields of crops during the Great Depression, and their games were played in dirt lots next to roadside camps. Had put a burden on America's youth, but poverty added a layer of dust and dislocation for these kids. Even young children labored alongside their parents, crouching to help them, so they weren't immune to the struggle. Some were as young as 6 years old, picking beans or cotton grapes for a few cents a day. By the conclusion of each shift, their tiny fingers were raw and blistered, making school a luxury that never went away. By the time they started a new school, they had to relocate again, which caused ongoing disruption. When they finally made it to school, they were frequently called Oi kids, which their clothes were patched, and they were made fun of by their peers and occasionally even teachers. Their accents and dust-bitten skin were immediately identified by being sun-bleached and frequently shared among siblings. Hunger-induced quiet separated them all, and some schools wouldn't accept them. Others, however, insisted that they clean the restrooms before class. These kids had a unique kind of resilience in the face of hardship. They learnt to look for their younger siblings while working. Parents mended broken shoes and carried jugs of water to the fields, with rubber scraps, and assisted in extending meals composed of grease, cornmeal, and beans. Despite the challenges, there were some minor victories. Relief organizations occasionally gave books, soap, and even temporary children could read and giggle in the few stable government camps, and gain knowledge, even if it was just briefly. For a child who had endured homelessness, hunger, and dust storms, it was a beginning for some to recall these years as ones of unity rather than merely deprivation. Despite their poverty, families remained close-knit and shared housework, music, and storytelling, formed lifelong relationships with children who might not have had toys, birthdays, or summer holidays. But they had each other, and as they grew older, many of them carried that perseverance into adulthood by becoming the first members of their family to obtain steady employment, complete high school, or enter the. They were children of dust, undoubtedly, but they were also children of tenacity, as demonstrated by the Dust Bowl. As migrants labored in California's camps and farms, their tales persisted. They evolved into songs, which served as a means of both solace and retaliation. When words alone weren't enough, used the rhythm of guitar strings to uphold dignity and fight injustice. And the folk ballad's lyrics about the migrants' suffering, pride, and tenacity came to life. And nowhere was this more apparent than in Woody's music. Being a native of Oklahoma, Guthrie went with migrants and became the voice of the displaced, plucked in the same fields and slept in the same camps. He sang his songs weren't abstract. They were named after actual places, challenges, and situations. For instance, Madame Rem cautioned potential migrants that California wasn't. California is a Garden of Eden, the paradise they had envisioned, a place to live or visit, yet still believe in. If you don't have the doughy Guthrie singing resonating across dusty surroundings, you won't find it as hot. Songs performed by camps on worn-down guitars, harmonas, or just out loud. These weren't merely songs. They were oral histories that were passed down from tent to tent and worker to worker. Guthrie wasn't the only one who transformed their shared suffering into a source of strength by reminding listeners they weren't alone. Migrants in the camps wrote their own songs about the harsh boss of the destroyed farms. Songs like The Long Road West and Hopes for a Better Tomorrow were honest when politicians refused to talk about exploitation, publications didn't. Hunger, police abuse, and dashed hopes, but also of faith, love. And ultimately, this music contributed to a broader cultural movement and impacted the burgeoning American folk culture. Introduced listeners outside of California to the grim realities of Dust Bowl living. Over time, these songs sowed the seeds of activism and fostered empathy for refugees, helped increase support for reform by humanizing data, penetrating apathy, and challenging. The melody disproved the myth that the migrants were unwelcome or lazy, because the music persisted even after the land failed, the labor was harsh, and the people were antagonistic. Souls give voice to the voiceless while bodies starved, reminding everyone under a canvas roof, you matter, you belong, and you persevere, man, woman, and child. In addition to their own music, the refugees discovered a literary voice that would reverberate well beyond the camps. Maybe that voice belonged to California resident John Steinbeck, who saw the Dust Bowl exodus firsthand and made The Displaced People's Situation one of the most influential books in American history, The Grapes of Wrath, which was released in 1939. The fictional Joad family from Oklahoma was followed by Wrath, as they made the terrifying travel west and came upon the harsh realities of life as a migrant. Yet although the characters were made up, Steinbeck's pain was quite genuine. Visited migrant camps, interacted with families, and meticulously chronicled their lives, which infuriated him. Malnutrition, police brutality, wage theft, and the degradation of his words were not kind. Rather, they were frank, angry, and unyielding. Saw men fracturing under the humiliation of women, newborns starving to death, and instead than romanticizing the impoverished, Steinbeck respected them for what he observed in them: backbreaking, labor while concealing pregnancies. The book caused what some dubbed a firestorm because of its tenacity and refusal to die. Steinbeck was chastised by local authorities and un-American growers for allegedly slandering and exaggerating one California even. If the Chamber of Commerce destroyed copies of the book, readers nationwide were unable to turn away. Steinbeck's work accomplished more than just giving names to faceless okays, stories, and pulsing hearts. Rather than increase awareness, it compelled action. His reporting, together with the Grapes of Wrath's popularity, aided in pressuring the federal government to look into labor violations and enhance conditions for migrants, drawing public attention to a problem that many people would have wanted to overlook. And just as it was significant because it kept a record long after the camps disappeared and the winds ultimately, Steinbeck's tale endured for the kids and grandkids of the Dust Bowl migrants, served as a reminder that their families' struggles were significant and that The Grapes of Fury declared that struggle had been witnessed during a period when the impoverished were supposed to endure in silence, called on the country to pay attention, and many did, as occasionally the most powerful. Steinbeck's form of resistance is a narrative rather than a song or protest placard. As the Dust Bowl migrants poured into California and the American public, they told it like no one else could. To realize the extent of the catastrophe, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's federal government was compelled to take action. The misery was just too obvious to overlook. Children were going hungry in camps. Desperate workers were crammed into overflowing fields, and America's reputation as the land of opportunity was. As the New Deal unfolds in real time, Roosevelt's extensive series of initiatives aimed at saving the nation from the Great Depression. But the New Deal didn't address all of the issues faced by migrants. It was a watershed moment for organizations such as the Resettlement Administration and afterwards, the Farm Security Administration. FSA was established to provide assistance, and the FSA specifically concentrated on maintaining dignity and trying to find long-term solutions. It constructed government-run work camps in California and other states in response to the predicament of relocated rural families, organized neighborhoods with sanitary restrooms, healthcare facilities, educational institutions, and even playgrounds. Although these camps were not opulent, families who had previously lived in wayside tents and ditches found them to be residents of the sanctuaries, choose their own leaders, and resolved conflicts among themselves, resulting in some of the only democratic areas these families were familiar with. The camps also turned into cultural refugees. Libraries hosted music events, and many people took English and farming classes. These areas saw the emergence of a new rural American identity that prioritized self-governance. Outside the camps, the New Deal provided employment through the Works Progress Administration, WPA, and fostered a sense of unity and pride. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, despite the fact that they were frequently difficult to reach for temporary immigrants, yet among the most enduring contributions was not made in cash, but rather in documentation. A group of photographers led by Dorothea Lange was dispatched to document her eerie snapshot of her migrating mother became an instant personal consequence of the situation. Emblem of the hardships of the Dust Bowl era, it gave the faceless a face. Disregarding a voice, not all humanitarian efforts have reached everyone due to racism and red tape. While local opposition frequently left out those most in need of assistance, but for many families, the New Deal wasn't simply a policy. It served as a lifeline and evidence that the government was finally attempting to listen. And by the late 1930s, assistance finally arrived before it was too late. After years of exploitation, many Dust Bowl migrants were organizing instead of just surviving. What started off as silent complaints had reached a critical point due to promises and demeaning working conditions. The fields developed into a movement that included labor demonstrations, strikes and boycotts, swept throughout the agricultural valleys of California as migrants called for improved pay, safer living conditions, and basic human rights. Dignity. The growers were wealthy and powerful, and it was a risky venture. With the police on their side and political ties, striking employees were frequently, some were banned from future jobs after being arrested, assaulted, or driven out of town. Despite the danger, the workers kept their ground when hired enforcers attacked others. Various grassroots groups, such as the United Canary Islands and the Canary and Agricultural Workers Industrial Union, UCAPA, the Agricultural Packing and Allied Workers of America, started to take shape. Despite frequently being fragmented and underfunded, these unions provided an uncommon but crucial support system that assisted in teaching employees negotiation skills, peaceful protest techniques, and documentation of abuses. Joining a strike was more than just a financial decision for many migrants, particularly women. Mothers marched with their children in their arms, and teenage daughters participated in the Voice campaign, stood in picket lines next to fathers in certain camps, where whole families were forced to leave, for attempting to unionize. But the bravery persisted in Huge Cotton in 1933 and 1934. Thousands of workers in the San Joaquin Valley went on strike. The strike attracted national attention as growers attempted to halt it through violence and intimidation. Workers received a small pay raise following weeks of protest, demonstrating that resistance might benefit journalists and photographers, took photographs of weary but defiant pickers and labor organizers, and authors chronicled these revolutions, such as Luisa Moreno and Dolores Huerta, who stood on the shoulders of these, even if their most well-known work would come later. The Dust Bowl migrants and other early migration movements weren't merely destitute individuals. They were, despite their accents designating them as political actors, survivors, and warriors, they refused to be hushed since they were no longer merely strangers, and their attire revealed their poverty. Having been harmed by the weather and the economy, they were now influencing the story in order to defend themselves. They started to alter not only their own lives, but also the course of American work in the future. And their conflict was only getting started by the early 1940s, when the dust was at its worst. Rain had finally returned to the plains after Bowl, with the economy supported by the AS. World War II's demands started to subside. Many migrant families who had previously been dispersed from field to field found stable employment, long-term residences, and a tenuous sense of normalcy. But the movement had already left a profound and permanent cultural, political, and emotional imprint on American society. The youngsters who once harvested fruit in the scorching heat grew up to serve in the military, used the GI Bill to pay for college, and have a family. Of their own, some returned to farming, this time with a deeper regard for the environment and the soil, while others relocated to places like Bakersfield and Los Angeles, creating the framework for working-class communities that still remain today. And the Dust Bowl exodus changed California's cultural landscape. Outsiders' O'Case music progressively assimilated into the state's culture. New genres were created by fusing local customs with language and ideals, such as the Bakersfield sound. In country music, which was popularized by musicians like Merle Haggard, a migrant's son, the anguish and pride of those years persisted. They simply spoke in other ways. The Grapes of Wrath became a classic on American bookshelves, serving as a reminder of both the nation's political harshness and compassion during the Dust Bowl era supported land conservation initiatives, the labor rights movement, and increased awareness of the need for a social safety net. The Dust Bowl imparted environmental lessons in addition to historical ones. America's soil conservation districts were created to prevent land abuse, and farming methods were changed, and ecological stewardship gained national attention. The scars caused by careless farming were, perhaps the longest-lasting and most profound legacy was that of these migrants' fortitude in the face of starvation, economic ruin, and nature's fury and hatred, having been spit on, excluded, and pushed aside. But they persevered as Dust Bowl descendants. They adapted and contributed to the creation of the modern West. Stories of adversity and perseverance are still preserved by migrants in Dusty Family albums. In the lyrics of a Guthrie song, they recall from old camp pictures, because not only was the Dust Bowl a catastrophe, but it also marked a turning point in American history. Additionally, if you're determined, picture a world without paper, books, or Google. For the majority of our time, memory and voice were the norm in almost every human society. Existed long before information was kept in the form of ink, flowing onto parchment or alphabets engraved onto stone. Oral tradition included spoken rites, songs, and stories. It wasn't merely a technique of information exchange, it served as the main force behind civilization. Stories weren't told in these communities since remembrance was a holy obligation. Just for amusement, they served as conduits for morality, identity, and elders who survived transmitted creation myths, ancestors' rules, rituals, and hunters recalled periodic rituals that taught farmers about planting seasons. Parents used fables and parables to teach children life lessons while navigating the terrain through rhythmic recitations. The voice conveyed important information about who we are, where we're from, and how to live. Due to the lack of written documentation, oral societies evolved sophisticated memory, methods to retain information such as rhythm, rhyme, meter, and repetition. Weren't mnemonic devices and stylistic decisions gave the story's structure. For this reason, epics and chants had to be in a memorable setting. In a world where the past was only remembered orally, forgetting wasn't a passing lapse but rather a societal crisis. Tradition was dynamic and ever-changing with each retelling. Using a current pulse, a storyteller may modify a story for a different audience or change the focus based on in this atmosphere. Oral knowledge became both durable and flexible. The breathing archive moved, spoke, and danced instead of being kept on dusty shelves. In Many societies, storytellers themselves possessed great social authority. They were respected because they preserved memories rather than only performing. In certain regions, truth bearers served as political advisors or spiritual mentors. In others, they were solely in charge of conserving centuries' worth of knowledge. After losing a great storyteller could result in the loss of a country's history, but cultures did not fall into oblivion when written words were absent. Oral tradition provided continuity between generations and other means of thriving. Wove time together, linking the past to the future, the living to the dead, the individual to the community, and it continues to do so in many parts of the world, including the historical center of West Africa. It remembers to live in the voice of the Go-A figure when it walks and talks. He is simultaneously a diplomat, genealogist, musician, storyteller, and historian. Spiritual mentor in communities ranging from Guinea to Senegal to Mali-preserved centuries' worth of memories without ever writing a word. The Go's function extends beyond culture. For the Mandai peoples and other griots who maintain oral traditions, it is crucial. Records entrusted with the accumulated wisdom of empires, clans, and lineages. They are aware of who got married, who fought, in which conflicts, what agreements were made, and what myths each town has. Name a Go is able to narrate a genealogy spanning dozens of generations. Without a doubt, this isn't just any old narrative. Endure rigorous apprenticeships for years or even decades starting at a young age. Taught to play intricate tunes on ancient instruments like the kora and remember thousands of lines of verse, and recognize the spiritual, political, and historical significance of every phrase. From master to apprentice, age after generation, information is transmitted verbally. When a ruler makes a significant decision, griots frequently advise kings and leaders in royal courts. Choosing to join an alliance or marry into a rival tribe or go to war is the person who reminds leaders of historical precedents, past errors, or archaic. In this regard, promises serve as both moral pillars and entertainment. Role contributes to maintaining. Leadership's legitimacy and wisdom, even now, in the digital era, continues to have an impact. They perform at weddings. Their tales serve as a reminder to communities during national occasions, funerals, and naming rituals. Griots use their voices to express their identity and the things they have conquered. The capacity to maintain African identity and togetherness across centuries of change, when colonialism threatened to eradicate. By ignoring oral histories, they demonstrated that history was a live criticism, that oral tradition was not archaic, and that memory could persist outside of paper, but profound. In fact, a large portion of what we already know about civilizations like as Mali or Songhai originates from griots who never cease singing, not colonial records. Strolling libraries, time machines, and, in their absence, extended if the Pacific Ocean's inhabitants had not had GPS or compasses. African history would have disappeared thousands of years ago. Were already skilled navigators who mapped one of the biggest canoes from small ones. Vast stretches of water on Earth that traveled thousands of miles between islands without any recorded maps instructions rather than relying on oral tradition, which has a profound embodied knowledge that is passed on from one generation to the next and is kept in the bones and blood of. At the core of this custom were the very skilled wayfinders, using the stars, ocean waves, cloud formations, and bird, flight, navigators' patterns, and even the water's hue to navigate. This information wasn't based on conjecture. Rather, it was thoroughly tested. Decades of travel, but instead of being recorded, it was committed to memory through teachings of chants, songs, and visions. One of the most well-known instances of this oral tradition over many years in religious instruction. The memory system is the mental map that Polynesian navigators utilize as a star compass. Separated the horizon into distinct locations that corresponded with the stars rising and setting. Each star had a purpose, and wayfinders used for seasonal timing would recite these stars in a pattern, leaving a lasting impression on entire navigational paths into their brains, similar to a living GPS. And the information didn't end there. Astronomy. Navigators committed island sequences and tales of previous ocean voyages to memory. Because navigating wasn't solely about seasonal winds and oral genealogies of their own ancestry, traveling was about discovering who you were, sailing the seas, and following your oral tradition is also preserved, allowing you to reconnect with your ancestors on every journey. Cultural history, Genesis stories, mythology of great migrations, and the actions of illustrious mariners were told with honor. These stories weren't merely. They served as survival guides that provided information on where to go and when to do it. Fresh water, which reefs to stay away from, and which signs to pay attention to when. When European explorers first arrived in the Pacific, they were astounded by how accurate these navigators were. Some even discounted their knowledge as instinct or chance. But centuries later, contemporary scholars started to rediscover the vast cognitive today's Polynesian voyaging societies are sophisticated, bringing back these oral traditions and teaching the next generation how to navigate without technology, because in Polynesia, to make to forget is to be lost at sea. To talk is to sail, and to recall is to steer. Bards traveled from town to town performing epics long before the written word became ingrained in Greek culture. The term tales that would define Western literature reverberated among these storytellers for millennia. Whether Homer was a combination of multiple voices or a single historical figure, the Iliad and Odyssey by Homer are imposing examples of the strength of oral tradition. They were more than just tales. They were live performances that were frequently performed with the lyre's Homeric epics, were passed down orally from bard to bard. The Iliad alone has over 15,000 lines. Of the design holds the solution to the question of how someone could ever recall everything of formulaic phrase repetition in spoken composition, such as rosy-fingered. The repeated terms dawn and swift-footed Achilles weren't merely lyrical. Flourishes, which served as memory aids and clues woven throughout the story to keep the actor on course. Due to the versatility of oral composition, no two recitations were ever similarly. A bard could shorten or lengthen the narrative based on the audience, including regional heroes or oral tradition, enabled the epics to stay current by highlighting various emotional beats in this way. Even though their fundamentals remained the same, each generation's Homeric epics were more than amusement, moral guidance, historical recollection, and Greek audiences learned about group identity through the tales of Troy and Odysseus. The performances are bound by honor, loyalty, cunning, fate, and the will of the gods, communities working together to uphold common ideals and remind listeners of their role in the fabric of memory and myth. For decades, the Greeks continued to recite Homer's writings aloud, long after writing was invented. Ultimately, transcribed the epics, but by that time they had already influenced Greek education and philosophy, religion, which were recited in schools and reflected in philosophers' writings, formed pillars of classical education. For playwrights, the oral tradition's success in preserving Homer's stories, they survived longer than many civilizations despite not being inscribed in stone. They serve as a reminder that, with proper care and organization, human memory may surpass books' durability, since in ancient long before European contact, reciting Homer in Greece meant more than just recounting a tale. It meant holding history in your breath. Without the use of written language, the indigenous peoples of North America had established sophisticated and prosperous civilizations. Oral tradition was the only way that their histories, laws, cosmologies, and scientific knowledge were preserved. Stories were more than just a means of communication in these tribes. Spoken word was a sacred force, stated that they were reverently shared and passed like ceremonial artifacts. Every country, including the Hopi, Lakota, and Hawanosi, had their own duty, own oral systems appropriate for its social structure and landscape cosmology. Animal fables and creation legends both described how the world came into being and how humans were supposed to live in it. Taught virtues such as humility, bravery, and respect. Historical accounts were maintained. These tales were frequently recounted in documents of migration combat treaties and interactions with foreigners. In order to strengthen their sense of identification and connection, families would meet in long homes or around fire rings during the winter. Elders, or spiritual leaders who recount stories, were frequently selected not only for their recollections, but also for their moral character. Specifically, unless it was used for a ceremony, ornamentation was discouraged. Stories followed rigid structures, including sacred sequences and appropriate beginnings. Not only was it untrue, but it was also disrespectful, going beyond oral tradition and history. Additionally, maintained useful information about native fire ecology, agricultural systems, astronomy, and throughout the years, tracking and herbal medicine were transmitted orally, and the knowledge of where to hunt, when to plant, how to read the stars, and which plants healed wounds. This information was communicated by elders rather than recorded in books. Childhood frequently through storytelling, music, or ceremonies. Even diplomacy has its origins in. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is one of the oldest participatory oral memory groups in the world. Democracies relied on reciting the epic and the great law of peace orally. Wampum belts and ceremonial speech, not parchment, are how the Constitution is kept. Oral culture was frequently disregarded as inferior by European colonists upon their arrival. Unaware that they were addressing cultures with long-standing legal and intellectual traditions in numerous communities, despite centuries of forced migration, the spoken word still exists today. Indigenous elders continue to transmit songs, names, and wisdom throughout assimilation and cultural eras. By bringing back storytelling events, some tribes are restoring endangered languages because they understand that when language stories also die, but memories endure as long as a voice does. It allowed nations to survive for a long time before the binding of sacred texts. Set on altars and wrapped in leather, the divine traveled through speech in almost. The early teachings of all major religious traditions were conveyed orally rather than on scrolls. In ancient religions, oral tradition, which was committed to memory and kept alive by loyal adherents, was more than just a means of communication. Hinduism is one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions because it was the very means of revelation. The founding writings of Hinduism were passed down orally for generations prior to Sanskrit priests, sometimes referred to as pandits or brahmins, were taught to learn a great deal of vast amounts of text, down to each and every syllable and tone. The Vedas weren't simply accuracy, was crucial since words were sounds that were thought to possess cosmic force. Pronunciation errors could skew the spiritual impact. Therefore, oral recitation was handled with accuracy, cadence, and respect in Islam. The Quran is believers believe that the Prophet Muhammad received the true word of God, which is not written down, but rather repeated. Millions of Muslims still commit the entire Quran to memory today, a technique called as his the oral here. Tradition is essential to the text's melodic cadence, rather than an addition. Reciting the Quran from teacher to pupil preserves its spiritual significance. Christianity likewise started as an oral tradition, and it links the listener to centuries of uninterrupted transmission. Jesus' parables, early miracles, and stories were told out loud in assemblies before the Gospels were published. Early Christian preachers traveled from village to village, addressing audiences that were considering conversion. Most members of the congregation were still unable to read the New Testament, and they were still told not to read the Psalms. Were sung, sermons were delivered, and scripture was lived in front of the audience. Jewish law's foundational texts, the Mishnah and Talmud, are taught through rabbinic tradition. At first, interpretation was maintained by intricate oral transmission networks, and rabbis discussed and talked aloud about lessons, frequently memorizing thousands of lines before writing anything down. Oral tradition in all religions made sure that the divine remained alive and active. Scripture is spoken and sung, and believers still engage in these customs today. Mantras are murmured and prayers are repeated because for the pious, the sacred is more than just written words. It is also heard, remembered, and embodied in human beings. Even long before recorded legal codes and contemporary courtrooms, communities all across the world maintained intricate legal systems through oral tradition, and justice wasn't administered. It was read aloud, committed to memory, and performed in these. Elders, chiefs, judges, and others carried the society's legal knowledge in their living memory, as well as councils that made sure that the public knew and respected the fairness obligation and punishment. For centuries, the Gaelic Browns of Ireland's legal system was conducted solely orally. The Bryan Laws are a complex and extensive series of legal academics with training, communicated the rules that regulate everything from honour debts to property disputes. They committed hundreds of lines and precedents to memory. These judges carried a heritage rather than books, reciting them. Decisions utilising exact wording that makes reference to earlier rulings and makes use of poetic poetry to help with recall and preservation. Consistently, many African and sub-Saharan communities depended on councils and elders to administer justice using oral processes in Ashanti or Igbo Zulu. Customs legal issues were settled in public forums, where witnesses testified and narrated incidents and rulings were decided upon by consensus. The lack of writing did not imply a lack of organization. Rather, memory was there. The spoken word had complete authority, and law elders served as the archives. Both were indigenous. Oral justice systems were employed by North American cultures to settle disputes and preserve peace. The Houdino's Confederacy made decisions by consensus and through condolence ceremonies, which were directed by the Great Law of Peace, is an oral constitution that is strengthened by beaded mnemonic wampum belts. Tools laws were frequently incorporated into myths, stories, and metaphors that reinforced these oral systems were based on principles such as reciprocity, respect, and accountability. They were flexible and could change with the times, incorporating changing realities without requiring written codes to be revised. This adaptability made oral legal dynamic that is ingrained in community life and frequently more healing than harsh, when colonial forces enforced numerous oral laws and written legal systems. Although customs were disregarded as archaic or subpar, they were anything but. They were historically educated, community-centered, and intended to preserve social harmony rather than just enforce governmental authority. Today, some of these oral legal systems are being brought back to life and respected in nations like Canada and New Zealand, where formal systems are incorporating traditional justice ideas. Because although they are charming, they are effective because in oral law, justice is something you do, not something you read. Here's something that resonates with you and that your entire community can relate to. At the core of each oral tradition holds that a person is more than just a narrator. They are the storyteller. The storyteller serves as a cultural memory steward, a teacher, and a performance. They use voice, whether they are sitting by a village fire or in front of a royal court. To turn memories into living, use gesture, rhythm, and passion. In oral societies, storytelling is more than just a performance. The best tool for a storyteller is an art form that combines structure, training, and purpose memory. But this isn't memory As most people are aware, storytellers frequently receive training from an early age, memorizing stories verbatim, through gestures, through apprenticeship, listening to the tone of their gestures, masters for years before ever narrating a tale themselves. Accuracy is crucial. An incorrect detail can mislead a lineage or distort a sacred narrative. But another aspect of the profession is adaptability. A skilled storyteller is able to change, adjusting the material or tone to fit various audiences. Emotional rakugo performers in Japan place a strong emphasis on performing in cross-cultural settings. Sit on stage with just a fan and a cloth, using facial expressions and pitch adjustments to bring huge casts of characters to life. In India, the Kathakal tradition blends dance mime with expressiveness and timing, using music to recount old epics, such as the Mahabharata in West Africa. Their recitations are accompanied by instruments such as the kora, which transform history into melodic storytelling. The audience is never passive in oral theatre, which uses memory as its script. Stories are shared in civilizations, and when people hear them, they gasp, laugh, and react because they know the stories. But listen to them again because the way they are told is just as important as how a well-known myth is delivered. Depending on the teller's talent, new, fresh, and even revelatory. Not only is storytelling entertaining, but it also serves as a teaching tool for history, rituals, lore, and a survival story might teach a youngster whether plants are toxic, or it can encode rules or directions in a desert. Considering taboo and kinship, the message is frequently hidden in metaphor that only. When a storyteller reaches adulthood, they become a cultural icon. They represent the past rather than merely remembering it, echoing generations. Because, in oral tradition, people's memories reside in them, rather than in books, and when they converse with entire civilizations in a world where screens govern. Oral tradition may appear to have disappeared due to algorithms and cloud storage, but this isn't the case. Fading. Rather than eliminating spoken legacy, the digital revolution has given it new life. Platforms with new audiences, power memory, voice, and narrative are once more essential to podcasts, spoken word poetry, and old rituals, remarks, and viral videos. Although the medium has evolved, people's inclination to remember via voice. Ironically, social media has returned us to 60-second YouTube video featuring a story from the ancient TikTok makers. Podcasts are the new campfires, bringing myths and folktales back to millions of listeners, where people congregate via headphones rather than fireplaces to listen to inspiring, instructive, or entertaining stories. And in many digital resources are now being utilized by underprivileged and indigenous populations to document elders, revitalize languages, and technology is also empowering civilizations by preserving oral history before it is lost. Previously disregarded smartphone recordings of children learning ethnic music, or elders narrating traditional legends, our whole oral knowledge archives are now kept online, searchable and shareable, and are being exchanged across countries. At the touch of a button, thousands of people can now access what was previously only stored in the memory of one storyteller. However, this poses significant queries about what occurs when oral tradition is preserved in a digital file. Can a recorded story have the same spiritual weight or energetic nuance as a live performance? Will the next generation be able to hear, react, and experience a tale in their bones, not only in their ears? The digital world both preserves and distances oral tradition. It from the live conversation that originally characterized it as a face-to-face narrative conveys gestures, feelings, quiet, and community. It is influenced by the atmosphere of, can a narrative still be alive depending on the setting, the listener's age, and the time of day? The answer might be found in balance in a digital archive. Podcasts can help retain memory in real time, so oral tradition doesn't have to disappear in the face of technology. Global audiences can come together through streamed storytelling. The method is not important. However, the goal is that as long as people are speaking and others are listening, tradition endures as a live link between the past and the future, rather than as a relic. And the following chapter is being written by speech rather than ink, nestled deep in the western desert of Egypt, beyond shimmering sun-bleached rocks and rolling dunes that resemble waves. The Sewa Oasis is a location of unlikely life and old culture beneath a harsh sun. Siwa is a mirage rendered real, a mystery encircled by dry devastation on all sides. Olive, trees and date palm orchards where there should be cold freshwater springs, be nothing. But its real claim to renown lies not in its solitude or beauty, but rather in the heavenly voice that used to reverberate from the sands here at this isolated outpost close to the oracle of a moon temple. a revered sanctuary situated at the Egyptian and Libyan borders, was devoted to one of Amun, one of Egypt's greatest gods, was not only a Nile deity. His sway stretched throughout civilizations, combining with Ra, the son of God, to form Amun-Ra, the god's monarch. But Siwa's oracle served as a spiritual lighthouse, as well as a place of worship. Location where folks met to ask questions about fate rather than to worship mindlessly and obtain responses. In contrast to the enormous temples of robbers or Karach, the temple of Amun and Siwa was a small structure made of mud brick and limestone that had been exposed to heat and wind for ages. The temple, which was tucked away among the town's sandstone cliffs with a view of the enormous sweep of the desert, it seemed more like a murmur than a monument. The oracle at Siwa was claimed to be the divinely concealed, intimately powerful, give responses from Amun himself through the high priest in trances or ceremonial rites. Those permitted to approaching the shrine raised issues of identity and war succession. Not merely pharaohs, conquerors, and common people traveled across the scorching sands. Siwa were unique because of more than simply their seclusion. They were also looking for a glimpse of their future. Despite being formally a part of Egypt, the oasis had its own rhythm, and its residents spoke Berber dialect. Its priests protected the oracle and were not merely state agents. The desert itself served as a physical and mental barrier with ferocious autonomy. It took determination to go to Siwa, yet hearing the oracle's voice was a gift that few people ever experienced with certainty. From the gods, or so the belief claimed, Amen Siwa's oracle was unique. Oracles lived in silence rather than in the crowded Egyptian cities or the opulent temples of the Nile Valley. Its remote location, encircled only by dunes and the eerie wind, added to its mystery, and people in positions of authority thought that the gods could only be heard in such silence. Because the oracle's rites were secret, the high priest, who served as Amun's spokesperson, would withdraw inside. Only a few people were ever allowed inside the inner sanctum. He would enter a trance-like state in a room surrounded by tall stone walls and filled with incense. His voice would say, "Carry the weight of heavenly wisdom." Inquiries were posed quietly, and responses were received and followed. Without question, the responses were frequently vague and ambiguous, but as profound as the Greek oracle at Delhi, the Siwa oracle hardly ever spoke in plain language. Its strength was in suggesting rather than prescribing fate. But in contrast to Delelfi, the Siwan oracle was also intricately linked to. According to Egyptian religious cosmology, a seer was not just a conduit for a god who was also king. Pilgrims braved the arduous journey from all over North Africa and beyond. Traveling across the western desert to listen to the oracle's words, merchants, generals, arriving with donations of oil, incense and gold were tribal leaders and even kings. Some came for individual advice, while others sought supernatural revelation into their most challenging life decisions. Others arrived with inquiries that might decide a nation's destiny, and the oasis itself contributed to the enigma at night. The desert became silent and unnaturally dark, with stars and wind filling the sky. Visitors would report nightmares that sounded nearly like voices coming from the date palms, visions or unexpected epiphanies following their presence, whether through ritual or implication that the encounter had a profound impact that went beyond religion. When seekers arrived, political leaders recognized the importance of the oracle. Its blessing was to assert credibility among residents and people throughout the Mediterranean region. A prophecy from Siwa could establish an empire, install a king to legitimize a war, and soon one man would put that very power to the test while bearing a question that no mortal had yet dared to ask. In 331 AD, was he a god or just a king? With a crown on his head and a question in his heart, a young conqueror named BCE rode into the Egyptian desert. History refers to Alexander of Macedon as Alexander the Great. By this time, Alexander had already vanquished the Persian Empire in Egypt and been crowned pharaoh, but titles weren't enough. Desired divine confirmation from the gods rather than from people. So he turned to Siwa. The trip was dangerous because there was no signage indicating the route from Memphis to Siwa. It wound over shifting dunes and searing desert salt flats on any clear map. According to Greek historians, Alexander and his convoy almost got lost and were only saved by ravens and other miraculous signals. Others asserted that they were guided by either divine serpents slithering over the sand or... These stories might have been about rainstorms or other unusual occurrences in such parched territory adorned, yet they capture the fabled spirit of the entire journey. Why did Alexander take such a chance? The secret to getting to the temple is his ambition, which goes beyond simply ruling the known universe, but to transcend humanity like the pharaohs who came before him. Alexander desired the approval of those who shared his belief in divine validity, that he was Zeus Ammon, the son of Zeus, not just Philip of Macedon. The earthly voice of the supreme god of the Greek and Egyptian pantheons echoed from the temple of Siwan. The priests, who were probably well aware of Alexander's strength, greeted him with great honor when he arrived at the oasis. His political clout granted him a unique privilege in the inner sanctum of the shrine. There is no thorough record of what happened at that meeting, however. Later, when questioned about what the oracle had revealed to him, Alexander came out changed, ambiguous. According to other traditions, the oracle referred to him as Zeus' son. Regardless of the facts, let's pretend that Alexander was given a prophecy of victory and heavenly favor. His actions shifted, and he began to present himself more as a quasi-divine leader who demanded allegiance rather than merely as a king. But the desert had bestowed upon him more than merely an response. It had given him myth, and myth was said to be able to move armies and create. The temple had spoken, and Alexander had reshaped empires and towns. The temple of the oracle at Siwa was situated at the intersection of cultures, not just geographically, but also Amun was one of Egypt's most potent deities for a very long time. Deities, but as Greek culture expanded throughout Egypt, Amun experienced a shift in the perceptions of the... He was reborn as Zeus Ammon, a combination of two great gods in the Mediterranean world. In the scorching Siwa desert, Greek and Egyptians came together to form a fusion that was more than metaphorical. It represented a larger syncretism, the merging of rites, images, and ideas that took place when Greek empires clashed, because Zeus, the king of the gods, wielded thunder. For the Egyptians, bearded almighty Ammon was the unseen one. He was frequently portrayed as the enigmatic force underlying all creation, whether when Greeks used ram's horns as a symbol of divine presence and virility, when they came across Ammon, they identified a known authority figure and gave him the name Zeus Ammon at Siwa assumed a remarkable role. The priests there were Egyptians with ancient rites, but their notoriety spread around the hellish world for tourists. Like the oracle of Zeus Ammon, which Alexander the Great used, served as a conduit between. If Alexander were to be proclaimed the son of Zeus Ammon, he would have the authority to rule both the Greeks and the Egyptians. Coined during his lifetime, the imagery of his sole heavenly bloodline followed him. Rain started to depict Alexander wearing ram's horns. A clear allusion to Zeus Ammon and his heavenly paternity was a political statement rather than a decorative element. The assertion that Alexander was not only supported by the gods, but also of them served to unite a huge empire where Zeus Ammon's worship grew because religion was used as much as a sword or the law. Beyond Siwa, temples were constructed or renamed in his honor in Greece, North Africa, and even due to the mystique of a god, pilgrims from various areas of Asia kept making the journey to Siwa, who was Greek and Egyptian, both familiar and unfamiliar. The temple had evolved into, it was more than just a shrine. It was a cosmic intersection where, in the echo of its oracle, civilizations, gods, and destiny came together. The voice of a world, not just one culture, may be heard in change, and during that change, Zeus Ammon ruled. Superior to the expansive avenues of Karnak or the soaring pylons of Luxor, constructed into the limestone cliffs, the temple of the oracle at Siwa was little in size, but enormous in significance. The building was perfectly integrated with the barren landscape of the Auri Hill. It appeared as though it had grown out of the rock itself, yet this was a decision made by the temples, its secret approach to the temple, which pilgrims would make through twisting streets, gave it power rather than its size. Paths and slender gates leading up to a hillside retreat. Compound featured a modest hall, a forecourt, and lastly, the Holy of Holies. This last area, the inner chamber where the oracle's voice was said to reside, was forbidden. To everyone except the high priest and a few chosen people like Alexander, its simplicity belied its holiness. There was simply quiet and the absence of large sculptures or golden shrines. Invisible presence of a deity. The temple's architecture was intended to. Visitors were made to slow down by the narrow hallways and acute angles, which made them feel disoriented and humble. Down to droop their heads in order to move in the desert with prudence and respect. The shrine provided seclusion and tranquility in an area where openness and grandeur predominated. The sanctuary was hardly illuminated, and the air would have been thick with incense. Echoes transformed murmurs into something unearthly that experts think the temple might have. The drama of the oracle is increased by roof holes or vents that allow the priest's voice to be heard in adjacent rooms. A god would make statements from the shadows, and those who heard them would be in awe, not of what they saw, but of what they were informed that the architecture was ceremonial theatre in addition to being useful. Other buildings, including priests' dormitories and ceremonial pools, surrounded the temple. Even in this parched region, Sewa was home to holy gardens nourished by natural springs, blessed with water, strengthening the notion that the holy hill's hands touched the oasis itself. May observed the dunes extending indefinitely, serving as a reminder of the temple's remoteness and significance. This location was intended for travelers, prophets, and kings, not for large crowds, to awe the senses but to arouse the spirit. And in that quiet, enclosed room, the centuries went by and civilizations changed the landscape. The future could be told from stone. Siwa's temple of the oracle started to wane, not in myth, but in voice. By the time the Roman Empire established itself in Egypt, the heavenly breath that had previously agitated the desert breezes had ceased to exist. What had formerly been a cosmic crossroads has started to change due to the presence of oracles. Between kings and gods was now a remnant of a world that was dying. There was no one. The oracle's silence was the result of a gradual unraveling following Alexander's death, in his generals engaged in fierce combat over his dominion, and the political unity in 323 BCE that had given the temple its reputation disintegrated. Even if Zeus Ammon was still revered in the name of the trip, to the magnetic pull strength changed back to the Nile and was no longer held. Valley, and to places like Alexandria, where the development of Rome brought philosophy and science to supplant faith. Roman emperors made token gestures toward new gods, new laws, and new priorities. Despite Egyptian cults, the empire's organized bureaucratic religion did not allow for the murky uncertainty of Siwas and other oracle shrines were increasingly viewed as charming relics of a mythical past that were revered but no longer consulted on governmental issues before Christianity arrived and expanded throughout Egypt. It harshly exposed the ancient pagan practices in the early centuries of the Common Era. Temples to the ancient gods were being closed or repurposed in the 4th century under the Christianized Roman Empire. Oracles were criticized for being demonic or dishonest, and in this broad religious upheaval, the moon's voice at Siwa had already been silenced. The temple itself deteriorated, its stones worn down by time, and priests disappeared during sandstorms, and the deity who had previously spoken to now, buried beneath the sands of history, Alexander and the guided monarchs stood silent. Still, tourists who were interested in its legacy discovered nothing except silence and ruins, but the mythology of Siwa persisted, and it was mentioned in scholars and dreamers have whispered that although the temple may no longer have its oracle, It had acquired a new dimension of mystery, and the temple became everlasting in quiet. For ages, the Temple of Prophecy has been preserved in stone rather than voice. The oasis at Siwa remained hidden from the outside world, buried not behind debris, but under amnesia, lived in peaceful continuity with its people. But the once holy temple was no longer a destination for pilgrims. Walls eroded by unrelenting desert winds, and although they were still told among locals, the legends had vanished from the world. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a shift in memory as European discoverers and academics were captivated by the surge of interest in ancient Egypt. Shifted there, focused to the Western Desert, where it was challenging to get its solitude shielded by rugged landscapes and exhausted tribes. Yet in 1792, the first an Englishman called William George Brown risked the voyage as a verified European. Others were attracted by tales of Alexander the Great's visit to a forgotten oracle by the early 1900s. When archaeologists and historians started thoroughly examining the ruins, the Akeri Hill complex was determined to represent that despite its modest size, the construction matched the probable location of the Temple of Amun. Descriptions of a central room with strong defensive walls found in ancient sources. Given its view of the nearby oasis, the temple wasn't particularly large, yet it was the precise spot where history stated that the site had experienced erosion, although some stonework and careful excavations. Since the building spoke for itself, the inscriptions remained fragmented. Each clue includes a stone altar, remnants of columns, and rooms oriented in relation to heavenly bodies. Verified that kings and gods had once listened to this windswept ruin. More. The idea of Siwa mythology was more fascinating than archaeology, that Alexander had heard things that would transform civilizations while standing here by himself in a desolate refuge, caught the generations of poets, historians, and tourists romanticize the trip by fusing fact and fiction and folklore into a timeless story that tourists still visit today. Siwa chose to sense the temple's echo of quiet rather than seek advice from an oracle. Despite being weathered, it is still standing, with sun-bleached stones and decaying walls. But something old and unsolved still hums in the air around it. Ruins communicate via presence and mystery rather than by using voices. While the temple no longer exists, the stones at Siwa serve as a reminder of what the world once forgot. Even though the god's voice is no longer heard, life is still alive in the Siwa oasis. Siwa's culture and memory are not a forgotten outpost. Rather, they are a thriving community whose members are stewards of a millennium-old legacy. Even though the oracle is silent, the customs it once sparked continue to influence the town's linguistic customs, and Siwi is a distinctive Berber dialect spoken by rhythm Siwans in Egypt. With evidence of the oasis's long history, oral storytelling is still essential. The oracle elders pass down myths to the family, exactly as they had in the past. History and regional folklore that combine pre-Islamic traditions with the Islamic faith. Many Siwans continue to subtly narrate stories of Alexander's visit, not from literature, but Siwa's building also captures remnants of the past from memory. The hamlet is lined with classic mud brick houses that provide cooling in the intense desert heat, and the abandoned salt and clay Castle of Chari continues to loom over thee while reminiscent of a bygone era. The architecture of these buildings depicts the sacred geography of Siwa has endured for generations because to its consistency in form and function is still revered, and the surrounding springs and pools are still strong. Cleopatra's Pool, a naturally occurring spring that is thought to have been utilized by the well-known queen herself, is now a favorite destination for rituals related to fertility, harvest, and healing, a practice by both natives and tourists, happen in many layers with Islamic prayers, but they have their roots in earlier customs as well. Marriage celebrations, such as the yearly event held at Gabel Dakur, help to preserve aspects of Siwa's spiritual heritage. Similar to ancient times, families get together, sing, echo, and make matches. People used to congregate at the temple to seek direction for life, not just for battle and monarchy. Sewer has evolved into a peaceful pilgrimage spot of a new kind. In the current era, not only for prophecies, but also because peace seekers who want to get away from the bustle of the modern world come here to stroll the palm. Groves contemplate a time when the gods talked while soaking in the arid solitude. Stone Sewa serves as a reminder that history is not limited to books or the ground. It endures in people's customs, memories, and the oracle still whispers rather than thunder. The temple of the oracle at Sewa might not no longer exist in all its splendor, but its legacy lives on in myth, memory, and for millennia, the voices of people who seek meaning beyond written words guided rulers and reassured pilgrims. Its quiet today only serves to increase its enigma at a few locations throughout. There was such a deep sense of holy uncertainty in the ancient world, where questions were more important than answers, and the Holy Sewa's oracle might be felt in stillness, not in ceremonies that have been restored, but in the tales we still tell about Alexander the Great's visit continue to be among the most fascinating turning points in history. Surrounded by sand, a mortal man tries to prove that he is more than human, regardless of whether the oracle actually proclaimed him to be a deity or only permitted him to believe such. The same fate was. This combination of history is what has inspired the ongoing obsession with Sewa. With myth, it poses ageless queries like, may humans become gods? May fate be exposed? Does the voice of truth only ever speak in riddles, or does it ever speak clearly? Most importantly, do we still keep an ear out for such whispers when contemporary seekers visit the ruins, not in relation to empire or conquest, but rather for clarity, silence, presence? The desert is still huge and immobile, and the temple is deteriorating but alluring. The same sun that burned Alexander's caravan today provides warmth to inquisitive tourists. The broken are still enveloped in the same quiet that once enclosed the Holy of Holies. Wall Sewa encourages introspection, not because it provides solutions, but rather because it has always respected the oracle's request, which was never about any ancient voices. It had to do with direction, confirmation, and the possibilities of the journey. Crossing the dunes was a ritual of metamorphosis that you didn't just arrive to. It was never merely a physical test. As we confront our own deserts today, the temple you became someone else. Perhaps there is still something the oracle can teach us about meaning, identity, and purpose. Not a loud voice from the past, but a silent thought that asks, who are you, truly, and what are you turning into? The voice is gone, the temple is dust, yet that there is still uncertainty, and that might have been the actual prophecy all along.